countries in the world that you are likely to be able to sell drugs to probably don't want you to become a narco state. They're likely to sanction you or have other influence within your country in order to prevent you from becoming a narco state so that they don't have to deal with the influx of drugs within their economy in the first place. Fifthly, I think the upshots are if the governments are tough on crime on either side, they're just less effective at it on government side. Okay, why is that they're just more efficient crime fighting at the point at which that the governments have it? One, I think at the point at which you kill high-ranking officials using U.S. weapons and intelligence, throws organizations into array because the internal power struggles at the point at which that you're able to decapitalize or be able to target much greater people, and also the point at which that they're constantly worried because they are fighting a much more powerful actor. It means that they have less capacity to be able to inflict the sorts of violence that would otherwise undermine your country. Secondly, undermines the moral of fighters on the ground at the point in which that you stop cooperating with the U.S. Why? Because your local soldiers feel like they're disempowered and there's a higher cost to joining cartels when the U.S. is after you and killing your leaders, comparative to if it's only the Nicaraguan government that's after you and killing your leader. Thirdly, you force them more underground. It's easier to find them and kill them in civilian populations, or you have less incentives to stay away when you don't care about killing civilians. Comparatively, if you have better intelligence, more information, etc. Fourthly, it forces these countries to decentralize. Forces these cartels to decentralize. Why? Because there's greater incentive for them to spread out when the U.S. can more easily catch you at the point at which that closer. Why is this particularly important? Because I think at the point in which that they can't amass huge amounts of capital or infrastructure in a specific place, it means that they have less capacity to do things like accumulate lots of stock in one particular area. This means that the resources are more spread out, which means they have less capacity to actively deal drugs or less capacity to maintain resources to do the other things. Basically, I think at the point in which it's easier for members to internally undermine higher ranking officials because it's harder for them to discipline them when it's the US backing you versus when it's the Nicaraguan government. Fifthly, I think at the point in which many of these South American governments are very poor in the first place, it means that they're often susceptible to corruption, especially amongst low-ranking soldiers. Comparative that to where the US soldiers are probably much less susceptible to corruption, at the point in which that you have less capacity to be able to enforce any of these decisions on your side, I think that it's just even harder for these governments to enforce this first place. Okay, then just dealing with all of OO stuff. This is what I don't understand about OO. They say, oh yeah, they're not going to OG. They say they're not going to punish you. Why? Because the US is not going to violate your sovereignty. Well, and they say, oh yes, and we argue by example that they fucked up these other countries. Well, 170 countries, something like the US has meddled in their elections. I'm unsure why. They don't give a shit about your particular sovereignty. Secondly, they say, oh, actually, they're not going to punish you because the Biden administration has taken more steps to be more diplomatic and conciliatory. Well, at the point in which the Biden administration is more diplomatic and conciliatory, that's also incentive for them not to be massive fucking human rights abusers in your country in the first place. I'm unsure why you're going to get the worst impacts that you claim you're going to get at the point in which there's going to be a trend where they're not going to punish you. At the point in which there's an incentive for the US to be this horrific thing and commit all these human rights incentives, at the same time, they have the exact same symmetrical reason to have incentives to not to punish you loads if you don't cooperate with them and undermine your government at the point in which they undermine your government. This creates more problems for your society in the first place because it means that there's more less stability of power because the US is lobbying against your government, which is funding the opposition, or at the point in which the opposition is unwilling to cooperate, you create more destabilization within your society at the point in which that you go against the most powerful actor in the region in the first place, who has stringent direct incentives, which are also majorly aligned with your incentives in the first place. I'm unsure why the incentives of these governments are not also to punish the massive people who are undermining the sovereignty and legitimacy of these governments in the first place. Then they say, oh yeah, well, you need to cooperate with these countries on other things. Well, yeah, at the point in which you undermine this cooperation by not cooperating with them on something that you claim is so important to them that they're willing to spend all these resources and money in order to send troops to all these foreign countries in the first place. I'm not sure why this is not true. Well, yeah, and then they say, oh yeah, they say a lot of the stuff the US does, such as airstrikes, only go correctly when you get satellite imagery. Well, Nicaragua can't afford to put satellites in orbit. Guess who only has the capacity to inflict these high technologies? Some things that means that you can get much more accurate cooperation comparative to whether you got information on locals on ground. When you cooperate with the US, right? Then you say, and then they give this brilliant example. They say, the US pulled out of funding the ICC because they were investigating war crimes. Well, clearly, if the US is so fucking asked about this in the first place, I'm unsure why they're going to stop intervening in this, because they clearly have the same symmetrical incentives in order to not take the fourth and continue to punish drug dealers in your country. Before I carry on, Naomi. Or, your partner.
All of the reasons that the US is motivated to assist and direct drug cartel fighting in South America are to stop drug flow across the border. What motivation do they have to prevent drugs from flooding domestic markets in South America, as they have since the beginning of the war on drugs?
Brilliant, yeah. Because at the point at which the US also now has things like foreign direct investment and like invest in the stability of these countries anyway. This means that US businesses operate in the country, they're reliant on offering US labor. At the point at which that in Mexico, for example, they make US auto parts. At the point at which that they don't want to destabilize the production of their other legitimate business interests within these regions and want to protect their foreign direct investments in this region, they probably also don't want to even if that was not the case, at the point at which the US is funding half of your drug enforcement budget anyway, you as a government probably have some degree of capacity or greater capacity to fund and stop the drugs flooding your domestic market, because you have more resources to be able to do that, because the US is subsidizing some of these resources that you're likely to be able to do that firstly. Secondly, at the point at which that you are cooperating with them, that means that you have some degree of say on where to target these resources in the first place. It means that if you don't cooperate with them, you don't have any degree of say comparative to what the US is likely to do. This means if you have some degree of say, you can probably lobby or internally pressure the United States to say, we should focus on these particular drug dealers or prevent these particular sorts of drugs from flooding this domestic marketplace, regardless of what I think. At the point at which the US wants to continue cooperation comparatively on these fields, they're probably likely to be willing to take out the person that you wanted to get taken out. Even if that wasn't true, at the point at which your soldiers are more empowered, have more resources, better trained, and better motivated to fight these people in the first place, I think you comparatively just have greater capacity to do that and deal with the domestic issues because you just have more resources, more morale, and more capacity. At the point at which I don't understand why these countries don't want to support the cartels which do horrific things in these countries, comparative to engaging the US, who is maybe an external actor but probably has symmetrical incentives to these governments in the first place and is likely to be able to give you the sorts of resources that mean that you are not entirely relying on this cartel support and supplement your domestic interests and stabilize your country. I'm unsure why at any point we want to stop cooperating with the US on the war on drugs. For all these reasons, we beg you to oppose, and fuck the cartels.
Thank you very much, member of the government.
All right, for my speech, please ask PYs in the chat. I think that the problem with opening government is that they put too many eggs in the implausible comparative of decriminalization. We're going to exist outside of that. I'm going to be talking about two things in this speech. Firstly, why the domestic approach to fighting drugs is substantially better and is precluded by this model. And then secondly, better illustrating what the scale of violence looks like and why we prefer zero fighting for the war of drugs than the status quo. Getting into the first extension about why the domestic approach is something that is better. Two main contributions here. The first thing to say is that there are other successful solutions to the war on drugs the US has an incentive to overlook. I think that the problem with Top Half is that they are presuming that the comparative is between decriminalization and hard on drugs. The reality is that there are a variety of policies that exist in the middle. As we flagged in the POI, I think that Bolivia is an amazing example of this, where after parting from the DEA for 6 years, they're literally the most successful Latin American country in terms of fighting drugs. What they've effectively done is create economic development in rural areas that previously produced cocoa in a policy that was known as cooperative cocoa reduction that allows registered farmers to grow limited amounts of cocoa crops while legally tilting their lands, which was accompanied by a gradual deviation away from cocoa crops overall. The reason why this is really important is that there's the political capital to implement these things because they are still shown as fighting the war on drugs to a large extent, whereas decriminalization is then framed by political opponents as pandering to drug cartels. I think that opening government observes that domestic governments are accountable to their own people, but in a more detailed way. I think that the actual reason why they want to implement these policies specifically is that if they can curb violence and crime in local areas, they do have an incentive to, right? Violence and crime, because cocoa farmers are still voting, are not something that are profitable in these regions whatsoever because you're harming quality of life. So insofar as there are counterfactual policies, there is an incentive to implement that. Crucially, the US does not allow these countries to implement these kinds of policies. We kind of get a response from opening opposition to say, well, now there are more resources to spend domestically in all of these programs. The problem is, though, is that the US is controlling the way that resources are used and distributed. And the reason why they have the capacity to do that is that funding the war on drugs gives the United States a massive amount of leverage. Within the security apparatus of these countries, you then become equipped to massive amounts of US funding, and therefore they always have a carrot that they can threaten to take away. What this then looks like is that all funding structures are basically determined by US central command. It's not the choices that domestic capacities and domestic agencies are ultimately making. The US does not care about these policies because the benefits of them do not accrue to the US whatsoever. It's not immediately shutting down drugs that are going into the United States, but rather it's about in the long term being able to fight things like poverty and drugs within these countries. And it's also just so far removed from the colonial logic of military domination that the US has literally never supported this whatsoever. So I think that we are logically prior to OG because we provide a far more realistic counterfactual. The second contribution that I want to make here, though, is that this has hugely worsened the domestic drug crisis that exists. The primary thing that the US is concerned about is securing their own borders and not allowing a drug inflow. Maybe OG says that. They never explain the strategic implication of it whatsoever. What this then means is that most of the drug resources in these countries go around to how can we best preclude cocaine and opioids going into the United States. The problem with this, though, is that what drug cartels end up doing is that U.S. demand, if this is effective, if opening opposition is right, slowly starts to decrease. But then drug cartels now have way more drugs that they then start selling into the domestic market. This is really important, and this is why the U.S. war on drugs has coincided with rising addiction within Latin American states as well. I want to note that the amount of drugs that can be produced is something that is somewhat finite because there's only a fixed amount of land per crop, and the more land that you are expanding into, it's riskier in terms of getting found out and detected by authorities. So basically, we prefer a trade-off where there's more people abusing drugs in the United States and fewer people who are abusing drugs within poor Latin American states. The reason for this is that the cost of drug use becomes internalized to the system in the form of crime, but really importantly, also in the form of rising costs in the healthcare system overall. Less economically developed states are less able to swallow the cost of all these things, meaning there's a higher opportunity cost of medical resource diversion to people who otherwise need immediate surgeries and people who otherwise need their lives saved to a massive extent. So therefore, I think that what we prove is that even if this is effective, it's effective in bad ways because the US only cares about border control, whereas we get more resources to get valuable kinds of policies under our side of the house. Before we get into our second extension, I'd love to engage with opening.
At the point at which, like, I don't understand why you can't have these agricultural policies at the same time as the US is shooting Pablo Escobar. The US doesn't say, oh, you can't economically develop rural areas just because you're doing the
I understand. Literally in no state that exists has this ever happened whatsoever because the US does not care about this, right? All that the US cares about are the immediate payoffs of like Donald Trump being able to flex of we are sending our guns into Mexico and we are stopping cocaine from coming in. Whereas it's only these countries, the cocoa farmers who actually want their quality of life to be improved where we can get these policies. Secondly, let's talk about what the nature of violence actually looks like. I just don't think that getting rid of the war on drugs is the most important thing in this debate. I think it's going to exist under outside of the house. And this is really important weighing. There's always demand for drugs. There's always an incentive of gangs and cocoa farmers to make money. There's always new spots to make drugs. Drug production can always go to other countries who are also vulnerable. People can always find new tactics to evade authorities. This is why in most countries, the war on drugs has never ended despite massive amounts of US funding. What we then care about are negative externalities. I think that OG does not do the most fantastic job illustrating this. So like some people might get shot by the United States, perhaps. I want to do a much better job of illustrating the scope of what this actually looks like. Firstly, it has led to a wide-scale proliferation of arms within Latin American states. What the US often does is care about arming things like local allies and local law enforcement. But the problem is that due to weak bureaucratic structures, they lose the ability to regulate what the flow of arms actually look like in these countries. What ended up happening is that a lot of arms ended up being sold in the black market and flowing to illicit groups, substantially worsening violence ended up occurring with gangs and leading to an upscale of violence and crime in cities like El Salvador. Secondly, this has caused groups and gangs themselves to militarize substantially more. Violence is actually not something that is very profitable. You get your money from getting your drugs and from selling it to other people. Guns and violence cost money for these groups and they cost lives. However, they had to militarize substantially more out of necessity because of the existential threat being imposed by US arms, making these groups more violent overall. Thirdly, the kind of policies that opening opposition talks about has caused these groups to factionalize in really harmful ways. We do not want the US to go after the head of the snakes. We think that decapitation and the targeting of leaders is actually harmful. The reason for this is that after a leader is gone after, you then often create power vacuums and large amounts of infighting in these cartels in terms of what the next leadership is going to be, causing cartels to like splinter. So cartels who were previously allied, like the Sinaloa cartel and the Las Zetas cartel, then became huge enemies and started fighting one another. The reason why this matters is that most death ends up coming from the US going after cartels. They splinter and then they have a civil war with one another. This is what leads to the wide-scale destruction of infrastructure. This is what leads to innocent individuals being killed and local economies being absolutely bankrupt. I think it's far better to just let cartels be, to not go after them, to let drugs happen because they're going to an either side of the house, and we better illustrate than OG this on the scale of the massive externalities that are occurring as a result of this violence, allowing us to win on magnitude of impact. For all of these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in closing government.
Thank you very much for that speech, member of the UP.
Thanks. Am I audible and all that stuff?
Yep.
Awesome. POIs in the chat, please. I'm going to try and engage opening government. That's how this debating thing works. Okay. Speech starting in 3, 2, 1. Before we give you our one big extension on the idea of corruption, state failure, and why that is logically prior to literally everything that has come in this debate, I want to do a couple of pieces of extraneous response. First thing is the idea of like the massive domestic and international scrutiny that exists on killing people abroad. So I think that insofar as like there is some kind of mechanism for the fact that there's going to be a lot of scrutiny attached to when the US does things like what Naomi was saying, like leading to the fracturing of groups and like leading to the sort of harms that are associated with creating more violence within these communities. I think that that's going to create more scrutiny on the methods that the United States uses as a consequence of this. I think that even if government teams want to claim that, oh yeah, the US can get away with Afghanistan, I think that they're far less able to do that when high profile stories about the harm that they cause come out that are covered by journalists internationally and that are pushed forward by NGOs. The reason why this is so crucially important is because it means that insofar as these things are always things that you need to be able to sustain over time, you need to be able to go to Congress and get funding for more money to put towards this war. If it's in a time where you always have to compete for political capital in Congress for things like investing in like getting like your economy kickstarted again after COVID and things like that. I think that this always means that you have a fight to do. And insofar as this is true, you're always going to be trading off the extent to which you can get more funding to be efficacious at the point at which you are you're doing things that are broadly harmful, giving the US a clear incentive to want to act, even if they haven't in the past, and to act in the future in better ways that are not just conducive to enforcing on their borders, but are also conducive to trying to maintain some kind of domestic stability on the ground. We're going to prove later on why it's the case that domestic stability exists on the ground for us anyway. But okay, actually, you know what? I think that works for us. Let's do some framing before I get into our extension. I think there's two things to note here. First of all, I think the US is a unique moral framing around the existence of the drug trade to note to opening government. So the drugs are probably going to be sold on either side. I think that insofar as this is true, this probably means that to the extent to which things like criminalization are something that are quite important, and decriminalization is the model that they choose to adopt, I think that this is probably going to make it far harder for you to be able to get support as these nations. It makes it harder for you to be able to get investment as these nations at the point at which the US sees you as ones who are actively proliferating a trade that they see as a harm, as morally speaking. And this probably means that you're going to lose out on things like that. It probably means that you risk it, like at worst case sanctions, at best case the degrading of your currency bonds, which means that you're less able to engage in international trade and control your monetary policy. To the extent to which that's important for all of the sort of agriculture export benefits that opening opposition tries to claim, but this is logically prior to that. So second thing, I think that like even if you this is just kind of tied in the same thing. Like even if you can claim some economic benefit from like taxing and incorporating the cartels, the US is still likely to take action against you and do things like sanctions or do things like taking punitive measures against you or trying to reduce the confidence that exists, especially when they try to frame this to the market and consumers that exist. So that means that like multinational corporations are going to find it harder to invest in these countries at the point at which the United States, the country where these like countries are coming, like these countries are coming from, are framing these like countries as being places that are so overridden with drugs that they have now been legitimized within systems. This reduces investor confidence in ways that makes it harder for you to get this investment. And given that this is what sort of the government benefits of being able to do things like get higher taxation to sort of get confidence being invested back into your systems is precluded on, I think that we're able to take this out. So let's talk about corruption. All of opening government's benefits are contingent on the state having enough power to go into local communities and do negotiations and seize land. Crucially, all of closing government's benefits are contingent on this as well, for you to be able to do things like fight back against these cartels in local areas and try to prevent things like fracturing and prevent like all of the outcomes that they talked about. So let's talk about what the framing is here. So basically, cartels are very, very harmful for individual lives and for governance structures. And so far as it's the case that they're probably going to make it far harder for you to enforce actual legislation. Because I think the thing to note here is the fact that corruption is seeped into these countries to a significant extent at the point where the US comes in, or even at the point where the US pulls out, for four key reasons. Oh, three actually. One, it is hard to oppose drug lords individually because of the fact that the power that they hold within communities, so they can do things like co-opt like aid and state resources in bad ways to prop up their position and their trade. It looks like the fact that when there's aid coming into your country, it's far easier for cartel structures to try and I mean, when you like sort of put these towards local communities to try and do building, it's far easier for cartels and cartel leaders in local communities to try and engage in pork barrel negotiations with individual local politicians and local leaders in order to try and get power back from them, in order to try and get these benefits because they control so much of economic activity within that area. And insofar as these are split off individually more, it's harder to oppose them because of the amount of control they have, the amount of manpower they have, and the amount of firepower that they have. Secondly, the police. The police is often so deeply corrupt in these nations with the amount amount of money that they take in bribes to not go after cartels, which are financed by cartels who are exporting large amounts of drugs, that this means that these people in communities no longer feel safe to report crimes. Because when they are victimized by cartels, when they have to deal with things like people in their communities being affected by violence or affected by the deep entrenchment of things like, I don't know, like addiction and things like that, they cannot go to the police anymore because it means that they're scared of being locked up unjustly or beaten by police officers or being handed into the cartel to do whatever they want to do. So that probably means that there's less confidence in local safety and there's just less ability for the state to enforce any kind of mechanism of law and justice, and people feel like the state has failed in that way. Third thing, investors don't feel safe in investing due to need to wrestle to control for land. Because for all of the reasons that OO and CG flag, that means that individual areas and local communities, large amounts of swathes of land are unlikely to be within that control of like random people, because it just means that they have the ability, because like, it just means that the land is going to be used to actually like grow drugs, to be able to actually export them and to be able to have the basis of cartels. The reason why this is so important is because this means that you have to wrestle with the control for the land, and you have to use the state's own power on the ground in order to try and get like power to like actually do things like investment in the building of infrastructure and shit like that. So insofar as that's true, and insofar as a lot of that power is limited by the fact that the state is already weakened by the existence of internal structures which do things like pork-barrel politics to undermine the power that legislators have to enforce policy. It also undermines the ability the police has to enforce things through a monopoly on violence. This just means that it's far harder for investors to feel confident in investing, and you're likely to have less of it. Opening government, go ahead.
All the reasons that you and OO collectively provide show why continuously attacking these cartels is doomed to fail. Is that not more of a reason why the states will want to decriminalize, which, by the way, subsidizing limited production of cocoa is an example of?
Oh, I'm about to go into that right now. Okay, so fine. So I think that like the capping of investment in infrastructure and goods and services reduces the efficacy of all state structures. Now to answer your POI in 3 ways. Why is this bad for the state? 1, you can't enforce policies because you don't have the control of local legislators, which cartels can buy off easier, and you can't get and like that means that you're just unable to enforce policies. 2, you can't get investment because of the little amount of confidence that people have in the reasons I proved earlier. 3rd, you can't control monetary policy because a lot of your investment exists in bigger formal economies that you cannot ever tax. When the trade happens in your currency, value leaves your nation without you getting your value in your currency back. Your currency ends up weakening. 4th, you don't retain violent control because the money cartels get is so high that they can get better weapons, have more power, manpower, and individual skirmishes. How does this change on our side? 1, the US scares people. Abid just asserted that Americans are not corrupt, whereas on our side, this is the mechanism that keeps people like local legislators, like drug concentrated areas, makes them keep their shit together, because otherwise the US will enforce repercussions on them, whereas they're not scared of their own local governments. 2, investor confidence comes back at the point where the US is present, and it means that they can enforce the monopoly on violence in order to control land. 3, the police is uniquely impacted because this means that they're enforced by the US as like local enforcers, and it means that they're less likely to be able to use things like crime, because it means that there's more of an enforcement mechanism for those people on the ground. This impact of this is that it's prior to everything else in the debate, because CG said that you can do better alternative policies, but you need the ability to enforce these policies in the first place. And so far as we prove that, we take the debate. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Government Whip.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Also, Naomi, maybe mute your laptop.
You're echoing. Yeah.
You can hear?
Just say one more sentence.
What about now?
Yeah, all good. No echo.
Okay, awesome. Starting in 3, 2, 1. I want to make it very clear that this debate was not about whether or not we fought drugs or even used violence to fight drugs in some case, but whether or not we conduct the war on drugs at the behest of the US in the particular way that we want to. Fighting drugs is not the same as the war on drugs in the way that the US conducted it. So I think that there are a couple of things that Naomi uniquely provides an extension that win. But the most important thing to take away is that the OO and CO case caused South American states to spend money and lives fighting drugs in ways that are organized at the service of the US, with the consequences of splintered groups and domestic markets flooded with drugs that cannot be exported to the US entirely borne by South American states. So our path to winning this debate is quite simple. We just need to prove that the harms to South American states, which have weak infrastructure and cannot cope with these harms of like increased drug use or of institutional instability, are so much larger as a result of the ways in which we go about fighting the war on drugs. The first thing I'm going to do is to set aside the counterfactual question of whether or not there like decriminalization according to OG or alternatives exist exclusively to the US model. The point to make here is quite simple. US allies in South America that choose to fight the war on drugs become reliant on the US to provide them with military aid. In fact, this must be true for any of OO or CO to be true, because they claim that this helps you to fight the war, and therefore there's significant reliance. As a result, you have to conduct policies in the way that the US likes. In the ways that the US like basically mean that the US holds an effective veto power over whether or not you can do policies. As the example, when the US engaged in a policy of burning down coca fields in Colombia, and the government tried to protest, they were shut down and told that they would have their military supplies removed if not for. That is why we see no real world examples of cases where countries have been able to adopt alternative solutions while simultaneously keeping support, because the policies are diametrically oppositional and the US keeps it that way. In terms of the middle road solutions that Naomi observes, doing things like economic development with regions or deals that allow you to grow coca, not for drugs, but for traditional medicinal and food uses, those options are things that states may choose to introduce in this world. The problem with opening government is that they bank their case on decriminalization being an outcome and cannot beat OO in the clash about whether or not that's likely, when OO gives reasons as to why voters will never accept this. But Naomi explains that voters may accept some of these middle ground circumstances, like they did in Colombia, in Bolivia, and Uruguay as a result, because they are less radical solutions. Therefore, we can imagine this approach is likely. But all of these states continue to use law enforcement, police, and the military to fight drugs. So we know it is true that in both worlds, there'll be some mechanism of cracking down on cartels, even in the world of decriminalization, because decriminalization still implies fighting the cartels. It just means that supply and using drugs personally is decriminalized. So for some reason, the confusion of the round is about whether or not decriminalization means fighting. In all the worlds, domestic police and military are going to fight. So the second thing that I then want to address is the most important part of our extension, which is to explain why the costs of drugs being diverted to the domestic market are incredibly significant. The claim is basically this: the war on drugs works at doing one very simple thing: keeping drugs out of the United States, because they're collected in submarines, because great brutality is used to make sure that they can't cross the border. But these drugs don't just go nowhere. They instead end up being diverted into domestic supply, which is why drug overdoses in South America have rose by 30% since the war on drugs, as Naomi notes, because all of those fixed costs of setting up your drug smuggling ring continue to exist. There is a path dependency as a result. That means that the drugs flood the domestic market and lead to these problems of addiction and drug dependency in South America. The reason why we thought this was worse than the equivalent outcome of people in the US consuming these drugs is twofold. One, more people consume them, because when you smuggle drugs across the US border, many of them are seized, so fewer people consume in the first place. Second of all, when people consume, they die of overdose more because the medical systems are less developed. And third of all, because the accessibility of drugs is easier because you're taking them across a shorter distance, more people are able to access drugs for cheaper prices. As a result, the flooding of drugs into domestic markets in South America, which was the direct result of it being harder to send the drugs into the US, is what has devastated these countries and led to drug crises. Two responses to this from all. OO says there are US FDI in these countries, which means that the US wants to fight the drugs in these countries. But there is a necessary trade-off. All of the military resources that domestic countries were previously using to fight domestic drug use and keep it out of cities and keep it out of the hands of children who die of overdoses are being used to assist the US on operations where US commanders run the operations themselves. But the second thing to say is that having FDI doesn't mean that you want to stop the drug crisis, because it's immaterial to the FDI. It doesn't affect your ownership of a mine. It doesn't affect ownership of exports in a material enough way to spend the money when the trade-off is more tanks. The last thing that I want to observe is the CO response to this, which is basically that the CO case includes a whole bunch of stuff about investor confidence. This is contingent on violence decreasing. But the big thing is that investment that occurs in South America is also going to go down when you have a drug crisis as a result. So if we believe that response, that FDI matters, as a result, we should believe that when there is drug use in these countries, then FDI will simultaneously suffer. But it is not a large enough motivation for the US to act, because the total amount of FDI in these countries is not significant enough to cause a radical reshaping when the main goal is to keep drugs out of the US market. That resolves the off responses to the claim. All of the derivative content on CO from that, which is like bribes and violence is bad, also apply in our world, because when the US decapitates these groups, they split into factions that go bribe different local politicians. That leads to violence. That means investor confidence is destroyed. And it means that all the same things happen with currency leaving, political corruption, and so on. So ultimately, the CO case is a bunch of reasons why violence are bad, but no new mechanisms about why the violence happens, and therefore does not engage with Naomi on why domestic use of drugs and domestic drug devastation is worse. I'll take the POI.
the US has the same incentives on either side. Why are outcomes for these countries better when the US just sanctions your beloved cocoa producers, acts covertly instead of cooperatively to snipe El Chapo, and punishes their economies and immigrants if the US is so big, bad, and terrible?
The Ott case says that the US has significant FDI in these countries, which is a reason why they won't sanction their own FDI. So I think that's tension on OO. But the second and broader reason why this is not the case is that if the US responds with radical sanctions, then it loses its ability to control immigration and all the other policy issues with these states. So that OO knife themselves in that is actually really significant. You should put that on your flow. Last thing that I then want to observe is the new contributions that Naomi makes towards the end of her extension to explain why the flooding of arms into the black market is very bad. Groups and gangs militarizing more means that violence and devastation occurs here. The weighing here is very simple. Opening government gave reasons about why you need buy-in from the local population, but buy-in from the local population is destroyed when the war on drugs floods drugs into these areas instead of to the US, leading to untold levels of devastation. But moreover, they never proved why buy-in was a significant enough reason that it significantly controlled the amount of drugs that were flooding into markets, whereas we gave very tangible reasons why the policies that the US endorses are the wrong way to fight drugs, but not that fighting drugs in and of itself was a poor end. And there were multiple ways to do that that were compatible with all the sides in the round. As a result, we take the debate.
Thank you very much. To summarize the debate as a whole, closing opposition whip.
Hi. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The fact that this entire debate just assumed that the US has no capacity in re-evaluating policies and has no capacity of deviating from the previous Trump era of, for example, building walls and having hardline policies is the very reason why a lot of times side of opening and closing government have failed to realize that the US can pivot in which on the basis of the Biden administration itself, and they're likely to reform the way in which they tackle the war on drugs itself. I don't think the war on drugs is specifically limited to the way in which the previous administrations have tackled it. And in fact, if side of government can hinge their entire case upon the trend that there have been failed policies in the past, why can't the US just not do that? Yeah. So I have 2 questions to answer in this debate. I'm just going to go house by house, like firstly dealing with CG and then after that OG. So firstly, very quickly on CG, because I think if you realize, panel, that the point in which you test a lot of the premises in which they base their extension upon, the case ultimately falls. Firstly, on the idea that the US has armed people, like number one, I genuinely don't think this is necessarily to be true at all. Like arms in general are extremely extremely expensive, and the way in which they pour money into the military itself makes it an extremely unstrategic move to randomly just give arms to people. But second, let's assume the best case scenario, and I assume this to be factual, that they have done this in the past. I think number one, the first thing I would point out is that a lot of times the selective way in which they give arms to people itself could have been the best decision at that point in time. But we will say that the point in which you recognize that if there is a proliferation of violence in these areas as a result of the arms that they have provided, then I think it is very reasonable for the US to switch the mechanisms in which they obtain information and the way in which they crack down on the smaller scale, like drug dealers within the ground itself, aside from using arms that are directly given to people. But second, note that the entire closing government extension is contingent upon the fact that the unit, or at least the degree of violence that currently exists in drug cartels, will never escalate, because the point in which you allow them free reign to simply pass drugs to the US instead, we then think it is contingent upon the fact that they wouldn't flood the rest of South America with the drugs that they fear so much. Because we say that the very mechanisms that hold you and deter you from proliferating drugs to a very large extent exist within the US. The fact that you are probably gonna get found out if you plant too much marijuana in a plot of land, that incentive doesn't exist, the point in which you remove the external factors of the US in and of itself, which means to say that drug lords under the side of closing government openly grow a lot more marijuana, openly circulate it within South America. I don't think they actually alleviate alleviate the problem within South America itself, because the problem doesn't just shift to the US in and of itself. Like, if anything, it just grows more within South America itself, given the fact that they do not have a very large, given the fact that they do not have any hold within drug cartels themselves to hold him against, like, for example, visually looking as if you are a drug dealer in and of itself. The fear that exists against US structures is exactly what holds them in check in reasonable manners that currently exist. So the question then becomes, is the drug trade any good, and should we just let them proliferate however they want? Because side of closing government thinks that's a solution to the drug war in and of itself. Number one, rather than the way they justified this was the comparative with using that they would rather the US be the ones that suffer from this drug war compared to the locals within South America. But that's not a comparative at all. How do we then alleviate the poverty that traps a lot of people within your country? Firstly, I think number one is just the assumption that the US will never be able to comprehend that poverty is the reason why people turn to drugs is extremely false. The fact that within the US itself, they are actively adopting more drug-friendly policies, the fact that they diss a lot of policies that surround being extremely tough on crime and drug crimes specifically just means that there is more progression when it comes to US policies. And I don't think you're confined to the ways in which we have combated drugs in and of itself in the past. But secondly, all the more because of this, they are likely to be able to implement policies in a way that help you based on the extension that Waji gave you in terms of economic alleviation from poverty itself. The fact that you can maintain economic relations with many different countries, the fact that you have some degree of investors flowing in the presence of the US under the veil and protection of the US itself just means that you're more capable of coming closer to economic alleviation that allows you to bypass, for example, the lucrative nature of drug cartels itself. And specifically because of that, note that a lot of the arguments coming from opening and closing government rely on the fact that you cannot have any possibility of conceiving poverty within these areas. And that's why there's no possibility for our policies to change. But we think specifically when you realize that actually a lot of decriminalization that side of opening government hinges their case upon also requires the structural funding and the support at which the US can exclusively provide. Waji told you that the failure of states within South America itself inherently mean that the imposition of these kinds of freedoms itself isn't something that you can manage on your own. So for example, like, I don't think this is the most important argument. Like, for example, just the fact that a lot of people rely on these, or the fact that people rely on these drug cartels and etc. from opening opposition. I think the second part of the argument, or for example, why specifically this is likely to change the game, the point in which people can afford to bypass these kinds of drug cartels, the fact that they're able to alleviate themselves out of the struggles of the drug cartels, the point in which they're able to afford some livelihood from the private investors that currently exist with the presence of the US in South America. The fact that decriminalization cannot just be allowing them to go free purely because of the influence in which drug cartels currently hold. If you allow them free reign, that is when you're more likely to proliferate the ways in which they disseminate drugs within South America itself. And in those cases, things like the violence in which opening opposition hinges their case upon is likely to come to its fullest extent from closing opposition itself, the point in which the removal of the US itself removes all forms of structural barriers into economic alleviation that would inadvertently bring you out of that kind of drug problem. I'll take OG.
This is a policy that all South American countries do together. Do you think it makes economic or like foreign policy sense for US to isolate an entire continent that is so proximate in terms of trade and immigration?
If you agree that the US is so shit and is so terrible in managing anything, they distribute arms, they're horrible in nature, why would you still keep them within the area for them to watch out for your long-term benefits? But then again, the second level to this is that the comparative then becomes, where is US involvement more likely to have effect? Is it one where they're far off in the long term, just watching out for your overview of decriminalization? Or is it one where they're actively involved in helping and assisting and aiding within these policy progresses within their structures within the country itself? We think the latter is more likely, considering the fact that they then have an incentive and an active role to play in aiding policy making in and of itself. The point in which you forcibly remove them and you remove all the external help in terms of aid and in terms of private investors, you're more likely to suffer from worse off conditions in this situation. For all those reasons, proud to oppose.
Thank you very much to Opwith and to all of the speakers. Just a quick reminder, you can take POI at 6:20. When you hear order, there is no ability to offer. Please keep your time management in place. Second of all, thank you very much. This is a closed round. You can ask us for the results and the feedback after the break announcements. So bye-bye. Please leave the breakout room so we can.
Can I just ask a question? Was this round recorded?
Was streamed. I said that twice.
No, no, don't worry. I don't.